and welcome to This Week at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash. This week, we're diving into the family history of William Shakespeare by asking, did William Shakespeare have siblings? Yes, he did, in fact, have siblings. William Shakespeare had 8 siblings. Well, the Shakespeares had 8 children, and William was one of them. 2 of these children died before William was born, making William the 8th child total. William was effectively the oldest child in his family. He certainly grew up as the oldest of their living children. And as we walk through what we do know of William Shakespeare and his interactions with his siblings, while it isn't much information to go on in total, there is plenty to suggest that William Shakespeare was both a good big brother and that he had some of the hallmark traits of being an oldest child. Let's start by going through the list from the top. We'll go through these in chronological order of who was born first, and I'll share with you what we know about each of Shakespeare's siblings. John and Mary Shakespeare had 2 children before William was born. They're both listed in the baptism record, as well as their deaths are similarly recorded, but they both died in infancy. In September of 1558, John and Mary Shakespeare had their first child, a girl that they named Joan. Her baptism and death are recorded in Stratford-upon-Avon, England, and she only lived a few months. The Shakespeare's second child was Margaret, and she was born in 1562. Margaret, like her older sister, did not survive infancy and died at just 1 year old, likely from plague, but her official death is not recorded. Margaret, like her older sister, also died when she was very young. She died at a year old, and while we have a record of her death, we don't know exactly what she died from, but we think it was probably plague. William Shakespeare was John and Mary Shakespeare's third child, and he was born in 1564. He was their first son and one of the few children in England at all to live to adulthood. Infant death was very common in the 16th century, and William was born right in the middle of a huge outbreak of plague, such that one of his great lifetime accomplishments was simply surviving childhood. 2 years later, in 1567, the Shakespeares gave birth to their 4th child, Gilbert. Gilbert and William Shakespeare have several interactions together. William's younger brother was interesting in that we have more information about him than we do some of his other siblings, but he's thought to have been named after a family friend named Gilbert Bradley, who was a glover, and that's the same profession as Shakespeare's dad, John Shakespeare. Gilbert, like William, did survive childhood and became a haberdasher in adulthood. That is a British word that refers to someone who works in men's clothing specifically, and they make the accessories. So if you needed something for clothes, like needles, thread, ribbon, or a hat, that's where you would go, is to a haberdasher. We also have record that Gilbert was in London in 1597, and at least according to the title page for Love's Labour's Lost, this was the same year that Queen Elizabeth ordered Love's Labour's Lost to be performed for the Christmas celebrations. I like to think that Gilbert may have seen his brother's play while he was in London, but I have no evidence to suggest that that happened. Gilbert and William seem to have gotten on well, though, because we do have at least one legal record that shows Gilbert served as a witness when William Shakespeare purchased land in Stratford. Gilbert went on to live a long and successful life, but he never married. He died a bachelor in 1612 at the age of 46. In 1569, John and Mary Shakespeare gave birth to their 5th child, another girl, and they reused the name Joan for this child as well. Joan Shakespeare came into the world ready to live a long and happy life. She survived to adulthood and indeed lived to be 77 years old. She would outlive not only William Shakespeare, but all of her siblings by decades. During her life, Joan Shakespeare married William Hart, the Hatter, and had 4 children, but 2 of them died in childhood. As a side note, I do not know the difference between someone who is a hatter and someone who is a haberdasher. I've read historical records of both of these professions being people who make hats. So there is an interesting side trail for you to chase. Let me know in the comments what you think the difference is. Joan and William had 4 children. 2 of them died in childhood. Her son, William Hart, who has the same name as his father, was born in 1600 and would have been 16 years old when his famous uncle William Shakespeare died. I expect he attended the funeral. William Hart must have been at least somewhat influenced by his uncle because he would follow in Shakespeare's footsteps and go to London to become an actor. He performed with the King's Men in the mid-1630s, and his most noted role was that of Falstaff. Given the extensive and well-documented use of young boys in the theater as actors, I think it's entirely believable to suppose that William Shakespeare played a role in his nephew's position at the King's Men, but again, I don't have any evidence to suggest that. I'm just noting it as an interesting thought. It is possible William Hart the Younger was named as much after his own father as after his famous uncle, however, because in Elizabethan times, it wasn't uncommon for parents to name their children after people they wanted their children to be affiliated with. I have no evidence that she did that, but it seems plausible. It's Joan Shakespeare's line that provides the only descendants we have of William Shakespeare personally. However, that line ended in 1670 with the death of William Shakespeare's granddaughter, Elizabeth Bennet, who died childless. In 1571, the Shakespeares again gave birth to their 6th child, and they named her Anne. This daughter lived to be 8 years old, but died in 1579 when William Shakespeare was just 15. The year that Anne died, the Shakespeare family was wrapped up in debt, and this just a year before, when William Shakespeare was 14, they withdrew him from grammar school for a lack of money. Yet despite their lack of capital, when Anne died, they did give her an especially elaborate funeral, which is surprising given their condition. 3 years after Anne was born in 1574, Mary Shakespeare gave birth to their 7th child. This time it was a boy named Richard. Richard lived to adulthood, but there's not much information about what he did. We do know that he died a bachelor in 1613, 1 year and a day precisely after the death of his brother Gilbert. The Shakespeare's 8th child and William Shakespeare's last sibling was born in 1580, and he was named Edmund. William Shakespeare was 16 years old, and by this time, William had not only been removed from grammar school as his family faced their financial troubles, but this is part of the piece of Shakespeare's life known as the lost years. So we don't exactly have records of precisely what William Shakespeare was doing at this time, but we have to think based on the chronology of when we can date his successful plays in London, that if he wasn't already in London pursuing his career, he was definitely seriously thinking about it by the time Edmund was born. William Shakespeare was established in London as a successful playwright by the time Edmund was a teenager, and William Shakespeare's journey from Stratford to London, whatever the specifics of him actually making that transition might have been, does seem to have mightily influenced Edmund personally, because Edmund went to London in the late 1590s and signed up to be an actor. We don't know much about his career, but there are plenty of rumors about what happened to Edmund. It seems that he wasn't particularly well received as an actor. Some generous historians credit that with a string of bad luck as opposed to particularly bad talent, but some records indicate that Edmund had an illicit affair sometime around the year 1600, from which he fathered a child that would die just 7 years later in 1607. Edmund himself would die just 4 months after the death of his son, and just shy of his 30th birthday. He was 27 years old when he died, and there was a notably elaborate funeral held for him. It's presumed that William Shakespeare was behind the planning of the funeral, because there was also a memorial bell ringing which took place, and both the funeral and the bell ringing are expensive, and William Shakespeare is the only person close enough to Edmund with the means to provide these services. Further evidence that William Shakespeare was behind the funeral is because the funeral was held in the morning, and that's unusual because most funerals were held in the afternoon. Some historians attribute the morning funeral to the fact that the players who would have been attending Edmund's funeral would have needed to be in performances that afternoon. That's it for this week. Those are the siblings of William Shakespeare. Go explore and learn more about each of them. They do have stories that are worth exploring, and we talk with David Kathman about some of these stories in our episode on That Shakespeare Life. David Kathman joins us for episode 65 of That Shakespeare Life, and I'll place a link to that in the show notes for today's episode so you can learn from him not only more about Shakespeare's siblings, but what books and resources he recommends you use to explore further. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. I'm here every Saturday with even more Shakespeare. And as you know, we love our friends. Become a friend of That Shakespeare Life and follow us here on YouTube and on our podcast every Monday. Thank you so much.